But I'd like to welcome our first speaker, which is Charlie Baker. Charlie is from Red Co-operative Limited, and I'll hand over to Charlie.
I'm going to take you through the highlights of a slideshow of a report I did for the West Yorkshire Combined Authority last year to try and show them how we can actually save the world and our communities and everything in them through retrofit. That it's a far better approach than the shiny things, which obviously the major corporate interests are lining up to have us all believe. Apparently the latest one is we don't actually need to, the sixth carbon budget that the Climate Change Committee is working to says we only need to reduce our heat demand by 12%. And then everything else can be done by the magical shiny things, which completely ignores vast quantities of other outputs from reducing heat demand into people's housing, health outcomes, jobs, robustness of the technology, not having a reliance on everyone else's on the big corporates repair regimes when the kit falls over and all of that kind of thing. But we do need to get on with it. And so my plea for tonight is to start a discussion that we can move pretty rapidly on, which centres around whether the labour movement as a whole, but certainly driven by the trade unions, because that party that we're supposed to have is not functioning quite so well at the mo. And we can crack on and make something happen, because I think we are spending too long shouting for others to make change to us, where actually I think we have agency to make the change that we want to see, albeit in a smaller scale, but at least by defining it, we will get a chance to show how it can be done. Basically, obviously, we've got an awful lot to do, and an awful lot of people saying, well, you do something better. My proposal is that we do. I mean, obviously, there is an option to eat the rich because their per capita emissions are vastly, vastly higher than the rest of us. It's a brilliant graph that done about 8 years ago by John Bartlett at Leeds Uni that shows that just the travel emissions for the top 5th percentile of our population equals the entire emissions of the bottom 5th of our population. And that might be a little unfair. The proposition is simply that we start with our own homes, because, and certainly after this pandemic, they've become our refuge for many. Obviously, in some cases, maybe people are dying to get out of them, and wish I wouldn't talk about them some more. But my point is that that is where we can build the change that we want. The proposition is that if we do this right, we can become zero carbon by 2038, we can be zero poverty by 2030, and we can do it with zero net cost to the public purse, except them ponying up the cash for the training. And maybe even that is something we should have a discussion about. The principle is not to just wait for the decarbonisation of the grid and the massive electricity bills that will come with that, but to actually do the demand reduction so that we reduce our space heating by about 3/4, roughly. It's between 2/3 and 3/4, depending on how you count it. 40 kilowatt hours per square metre of floor area per year. Some of the houses we've done, it's 5 or 6 times that. Some of the old basket case terraces. I've skipped a whole load of slides because we haven't got the time, but the basic premise is that we should be doing that rather than building new ones, because the carbon debt of a new house is currently equal to the carbon emissions of a basket case house, and therefore we should be retrofitting that house, because the carbon emissions of doing that will repay themselves in the first year, where it will take currently 20 years to repay the carbon debt of a passive house, for example, just because they use quite a lot of materials. But obviously the movement may well mature and reduce its carbon footprint, but that's where we are this year. And so the premise is that if we reduce the energy demand in our houses enough, and so a mid-terrace in Levenshulme, you could get the space heating demand down to 25 kilowatt hours per square metre per annum, which if you provide the heating for that and the hot water with an air source heat pump, and you're abstemious on your electricity use, but nothing too drastic, that's the average electricity use there, you could deliver that with 5 kilowatts of PV on your roof. Now, obviously, we've had an awful lot of politics behind who provides the PV and how that's done, but there's no reason why we shouldn't be doing that in a much more people-oriented way. The numbers on retrofit are difficult because each half of the energy you save is twice the amount of cost that the one you did before. So even when you're doing the last quarter, it's still very expensive to do. So you end up with that curved graph. And then when you try and repay that, obviously, if we can get Public Works Loan Board kind of borrowing into place, we can make those annual costs much cheaper. But if you overlay the energy savings, which are by their definition linear, in this instance, then you end up with a sweet spot where the cost of that demand reduction eclipses the savings you've made from doing it. And they don't get us quite to where I think we can get to. If we put PV and battery onto the top of that, it helps a bit, but you've got to repay the cost of the battery. But, and here is the one that I think I would like to get us moving on if we can, because if we don't, the major corporates will, and then the moment will be lost. And it's coming very soon. They've just made a modification change to how you sell energy into the National Grid's balancing mechanism. Ordinary people federated, which heaven forfend, the last time I looked was vaguely more our side of the political fence than the other one. We should crack on, because as you can see, that sweet spot where it pays for itself moves a long way up the graph. Obviously, retrofit costs are too high, but as we get better at it, as more people do it, those costs will drop. So if you take those declining costs and converted those into borrowing on those three little lines, you'll see that that sweet spot I referred to earlier appears sometime between year 7 and year 12, depending on the cost of your finance, which is then the other side of this. So if we do those retrofits at a pace where we can learn how to do it well, not expose people to debt, and crack on, then we can then sustain dignified, proper, really useful, really important, rewarding employment for a large number of people that will come on to for the next 15 years. And obviously we've not done a commercial stock in that, they'll want it later. And then after that, we revisit our feeders then pet and exploit ourselves and export ourselves to all the other bits of Europe that haven't caught up yet. That deployment curve then means that that bit where we haven't made it pay for itself is minimal. So we pay for that by rolling out our PV and storage as fast as we can, so that we generate an income up front without having to go cap in hand to Bays and going, please sir, can we have some money, when that Rishi Sunak's decided his magic money orchard is going to others, like Test and Trace, and not us. The other nice thing about doing that way is that then means that the reduction curve that the Tyndall Centre have provided for West Yorkshire, for Greater Manchester, and for any other local authority that will listen, where they want between a 13 and a 15% reduction year on year, to share the budget out as much as you can across the years. That accelerated curve means our housing doesn't quite match the budget, but it's a lot closer than any other proposal I've seen. And because we built up that income in the opening years, we can then provide progressive lending, like equity loans that you don't have to pay an interest on, and you don't have to pay back until you sell your house, and all sorts of things like that, cross-subsidised from the able to pay and from that energy storage revenue. You could get rid of fuel poverty in the first 10 years. It's not easy. We've got 10 points. I would, if I had longer, go through all of those. There's a lot. They then subdivide into pieces. For me, they are only going to be dealt with by collective action, and therefore a movement based around collective action seems to me to be easily the best place to get this moving in, because the sort of the conservative approach, the current business as usual approach, is all about IP wars and people doing it in their own way. The biggest opportunity here is that our sun doesn't shine necessarily when we want the energy from it, and the wind doesn't blow necessarily when we want it. And so that graph at the bottom is the daily demand curves. However, if you put storage in the mix, you can then do demand shifting, even supply shifting, because you can export power from your batteries at peak points. And then you can also then sell into the back end balancing mechanism. It requires a whole load of us to come together in some kind of organisation that gathers that together. But we can make potentially £800 of additional revenue per property per year, which can then subsidise those retrofits. And if I've only got a couple of minutes left, I'm going to scuttle through these. The finance vehicle is the other big one. We need to get cheap borrowing. Some of the major big landlords have been able to borrow at 1.6%. We should find a way of doing the same thing, because obviously we can save more carbon if we're giving far less of it to the people with the moe habit and the wide braces in that there London. The other point about a finance vehicle is it gives us a gateway that enables us to make sure retrofits are done properly, because you don't get the lending unless you do it properly. And we could then also start to tiptoe into the areas where small-scale private landlords would then see benefit in us playing. The number of jobs is enormous. The number of jobs is a complete potential reframe of the employment basis of this country. These figures are just for Greater Manchester, just for the domestic sector. 30,000 jobs, most of them tradespeople, but you've got to have some management, I'm told. So you let a bit of management in there, and then you've got your renewables and storage installers, and then and then some designers on top of that. That's not far off what Parity Projects have produced in the Construction Leadership Council's put my teeth back in, National Retrofit Strategy, where they're basically talking 700,000 jobs. However, they do it in this big peak, which doesn't seem to make sense because that implies that a lot of people are going to have a job for a year and they're not. The model we proposed to flatten that curve out. To make it happen, we've got to do a lot of things all at once. We've got to make sure that we do all of the components that I referred to earlier. But I think we can do that. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity to do it. But we've been trying it out with the retrofit get-in project, where we took out to work theatre workers and I've been training them up in retrofit. That arose out of the Labour for a Green New Deal posse up in GM, who are brilliant people. Check out their podcast, because there's a whole load of really useful people on it. Even I'm on it, but so's Jeremy and Kevin Anderson from the Tyndall Centre. What we did was we've been mapping the bits that you need to do in a retrofit over the trades that we've currently got, and most of them can be done within those existing trades. Obviously, theatre workers, the most construction they've done is set building. So we've then subdivided what they need into 4 different levels, and I've then been putting them on a tryout for a day to see what of these skills they've got, so that we're matching the skills with the jobs, and it's gone really well. Unfortunately, I've been subsidising that out of the money I've been making out of consultancy work, and I haven't got a lot of that. So we've gone back to the powers that be and said, do you not think this is both building back better, providing some jobs for people that have lost them as a result of the pandemic, and also doing something about carbon savings? But bizarrely, very little money about. But I'm not going to give in, because this has to be our future, and I do think we can do it. But I want the labour movement to help me do this a lot more directly. I think it's time we carry on shouting at the state to get them to do what they're obliged to do, but I think we should trial and get on with the bits and pieces that we can. Cheers.
So I will introduce our next speaker, and it's Lydia Merrill. She's the Environmental Officer for the University of Manchester UCU, but she's also the SERA rep on the Mayor's Green 5-Year Plan Group.
So I'm going to talk about climate justice. I got involved through the trade union when I went down to Brighton a couple of years ago for the Labour Party conference. And there was massive enthusiasm for the Green New Deal idea, which the Tories have now pinched, I noticed. But I think what we really need to do in this forum is to think about what's the role of the Trades Council in bringing that to fruition. And how can we do it so that it's not just older people like me? How can we do it so that it's actually with young people? And when I say young people, I'm talking kids aged 8 and upwards. These were children that I photographed in a waste disposal authority, and they were looking at how methane is made out of waste. And they understood why it was important to do something with methane, because it's a very dangerous global warming gas. Those kids will now be just about to leave school, and they'll be looking to do something useful. And they'll be looking to be part of a green workforce, because they've more or less been promised that something's going to happen by adults. But actually, we're in a situation where the local authorities are striving to do things around green jobs, but they don't have the funding for it. And before we think about the jobs, we have to think about the training. And I think training starts when you're 6. And I know that when you're 16, you really need to have something tangible to go for. And if you talk to my colleagues in UCU in further education, it's a mess. When you talk to people in Greater Manchester Combined Authority Skills Unit, it's a mess. There's no plan, there's no strategy, there's no joined up thinking. And the shift for people who want to retrain or gather new skills is really difficult, because if you want to move from a level 2 to a level 3 course, you might have to travel right across Greater Manchester to find a course, if you're lucky. So one of the things that the Trades Council can do is to look at the review of the skills gaps. And we shouldn't be doing that on our own. Basically, we should be doing that with the other unions. And we should be doing it particularly with activists in education unions, I think. I know the NEU, and it's really good to have had your support, John, over the years, have taken this very seriously. They're taking it onto the National Exec through Dawn. And they're being pushed by young people of 12 and 15 with a megaphone in their hand outside the town hall. They're Fridays for the Future. They're People and Planet, which are the University Student Union group. The Socialist Societies are still on the case and making a lot of headway, but of course you can't do much with politicians in the House of Commons these days in the Labour Party. It's people who we know around the corner who are our local representatives, who we need to influence more and make sure they've fully got hold of the crisis that we're in. It's a crisis of skills. So I've been working through the Women's Forum in Manchester, and I've been talking to my mates in Unison, my mates in the Bakers Union, Unite Community. And, you know, if Unite can win the bus campaign, if we can actually win that with such aplomb in Manchester, we can do anything. But we do have to listen to the science. And Charlie's just given us a very complicated story there about the financing as well as the carbon content of practical action on insulating your own homes and schools and public buildings. But we need to understand the science. It isn't actually very difficult. Every time we use fossil fuels, we are creating more warmth for the planet. And it's every time we heat our house, we waste that heat by leaving windows open, we're not having the proper double glazing. It's very simple. It's not complicated. So I don't think it's that difficult. What we do have to look at is how to support the 5-year plan that Greater Manchester has got, and how each of the 10 local authorities can push for practical change. Because actually Greater Manchester can't do it. They can't do it on their own. They can make grand plans, they can make graphs, but they can't actually deliver it. The delivery, as John Gummer said this morning, you know, John Gummer is now called Lord Deben, and he was speaking this morning and saying, actually, we need leadership. And he quoted good leadership, which was evidenced in the elections, as being Greater Manchester. He said that's an example of good leadership where you can rely on a clear voice, a clear strategy, and people respecting and getting on with doing a job. So we have to think about how we can, as a union, as a set of unions, we can demand to be upskilled. We can demand that education and initial training for green jobs is in place. We really have to re-regulate. I know Boris is set about deregulating the building industry because he thinks we're not building enough quick fix houses, but actually we have to resist that. Our own planning departments can be influenced. And I'm looking at several councillors in the group today. We have to influence our own planning departments. We have to influence our own planning committees. We have to divest from fossil fuels. You know, it sends a message. And if you get the money out of the fossil fuels from our pension funds, we can put it into reinvesting in skills development. So that's what I'm thinking we should do, because actually we don't have a plan B, and we don't have a planet B either. And we really do need to have local authorities pushing forwards on this. We've got COP26 in Glasgow. In fact, Scotland is doing a lot better than we are in England. They're doing much better on environmental education. And they do have plans for green jobs. They have, you know, they've been very, very brave and said, yes, we want to get rid of nuclear weapons. And yes, we do have a plan for what we're going to do next. And yes, there will be jobs. So we need to think about COP26 coming up in November, and how that kind of deadline can give us a real positive opportunity to talk to people. It's a public education thing we need to do. We're driving too many cars, we're wasting too much fossil fuel, we're wasting too much electricity. We're actually making life much harder for our kids. Those are young people holding those banners outside the university. They don't deserve us to sit back and fiddle while Rome's burning. And I think what he said this morning, Lord Deben, is that we can actually insist as trade unionists that our local authorities follow up. And we're lucky in Manchester, we've got a new committee structure and we've got new committee leaders who can start again, who can actually push forward some of the work that's already been put in place. And I'm thinking, you know, years ago when those cycle tracks went in, it was such hard work for the councillors who did that. It was terribly hard work and they were very unpopular. And it always takes a lot of courage to be an outspoken environmental councillor. But I think we have to encourage all our councillors to be outspoken and to be pushing for whatever tricks of the trade we can make, whatever kind of investment and inward investment we can get. And we're not on our own. We've got some really good people in, for example, UK 100. So I've given you the publication there, their new report. And I think we should make a huge fuss through our elected members in Parliament, because the skills bill and the planning bill have got no mention whatsoever of climate change. Like, why not? So we need to make much more fuss. We need to be very determined. We need to be together, and we need to be together with the, you know, on behalf of these kids, because they deserve it. They need it. So that's what I want to say. It's stirring stuff, and we're not allowed to leave it now. We're a trades council with a mission. Thank you.
I'd like to bring on our next speaker, though, and that's Martin Empson from Greater Manchester Campaign Against Climate Change. So I'll hand over to Martin.
Thank you, John, and thanks for inviting me, and hello to lots of familiar faces. I want to start by something, or emphasising a point that Lydia made right at the end, that any discussion about climate change at the moment in 2021 is framed by the UN talks happening in Glasgow in November, December, COP26. That's not because I believe that COP26 will deliver a solution or an answer, but actually because what happens at COP26 and in the discussions in the run-up to it will shape a response from the corporations, from the bosses, and from governments internationally. And if you want a flavour of what that response will be, you only have to really listen to Joe Biden's speech at the leadership conference on climate change that took place in April, or his announcement yesterday, which is an emphasis on technological solutions that will, in some form or the other, reduce emissions, capture emissions, or use alternate technology to produce zero emissions. And I think the trade union movement has to reject that approach, not because we don't need technology, we do need technology, but actually we have to be the people being clearest about the fact that the technology already exists, and that these solutions are really about mainstream governments offering corporations, in particular the fossil fuel corporations, the opportunity to carry on regardless, to carry on doing what they've always been doing. COP26, as the number suggests, is the quarter century really of these international talks. They've made very little difference to total emissions over the 26 years that they'll have been talking. It's a model that doesn't really work, and I haven't really got time to go into why here and now, but also it's a model, I think, that leaves working people, the disenfranchised, the poorest, and particularly people in the global south at a disadvantage when it comes to climate change and the solutions that are offered. So what can trade unions do, and trade unionists? Now, I'm firstly very inspired, and I think the trade union movement is inspired by climate change as an issue for two reasons. Firstly, because it's clearly an issue that excites and interests members. I get lots of we in the Campaign Against Climate Change and the trade union group, and I'm sure all the other organisations represented here, get lots of trade unions that want to discuss it, to hold conferences, to hold meetings, and so on. And that's great. There's a real engagement around it. I think trade unionists are also inspired by the social movements that are developed, in particular the climate strikes, which I think towards the end of 2019 were helping to push trade unionists into environmental action in a way that we haven't really seen beforehand. But I also am inspired because I think the trade union movement can have a particular role in dealing with climate change, which comes from its role within the workplace and within wider society. We can be part, and we must be part, of arguing and fighting, I think, campaigning for more sustainable, greener workplaces. I think there's lots and lots of examples on a local level where this has happened or it's begun to happen. We need more of this. We need trade unions to be taking an active role inside their workplaces in transforming the culture, the environment, to make a pun, and reshaping how work is organised, how people travel to work, how their offices are lit and heated, and so on. But I think all too often the environmental movement and the trade union movement could reduce our role down to simply that, if you like, those minor organisational things at work. I think we have to be much more proactive. For instance, I think the bus workers in North Manchester that Lydia mentioned are a good example where we were able, I think, as a trade union movement, both to build solidarity for their struggle, but also to point out its role in a future sustainable society. I think this is an important and key mobilising point. One of the things I think that's important that we do as well is that we discuss the role of trade unionists in terms of shaping how work is done and so on. People may have seen the new book by Matthew Lawrence and Laurie Langton, A Green Manifesto. It comes out of some left Labour think tanks. One of the points they make in it is that trade unionists should be on managerial boards or boards of control of workplaces alongside environmentalists and social justice activists to shape a response that's in the interests of people and planet. Actually, I slightly disagree with that role because I don't see why trade unionists can't also be environmental advocates. And that's one thing the trade union movement needs to do, is to educate and develop a trade union membership into people who understand climate change and understand the solutions. But the trade union movement also has another role, which is to shape a wider social response to climate change. I think that trade unions over the years in Britain and elsewhere have been part of developing things like the Green New Deal, the 1 Million Climate Jobs Report, which we're working on a new edition of at the moment. And this has been to talk about how we can reshape society in a socially just way, as well as dealing with the problem of climate change. And that can mean some awkward conversations. It can mean some challenging ones. It means, for instance, we have to have serious conversations about just transition for workers who work in industries that actually are not going to be sustainable, whatever the technical solutions offered by the likes of Bill Gates and Joe Biden are talking about that. For instance, the brilliant victory by the Rolls-Royce workers at Barnoldswick in January of this year has often been hailed as a green solution, and certainly the union leadership has pushed it like that. But it's a solution that rests on some technological solutions that many environmentalists are uncomfortable with: nuclear reactors, biofuels, and so on. And I think the trade union movement has to take a much more assertive role in shaping what they think that the solutions and answers are. The third thing I think we need to do as a trade union movement is to challenge false solutions. And this ties in with some of the other things that I've talked about. The narrative around the environment and the solutions to it, as I said, is shaped by COP26 and the politics of that, the new technological solutions. Perhaps the best articulation of this from their side is Bill Gates's recent book, which is a real insight into how a sort of liberal corporate billionaire sees solving climate change. Certainly he doesn't see it in terms of social justice or equality or raising wages or ending discrimination and oppression and so on. He sees it actually as, in his own words, as an opportunity to make money. For him, the role of the state is to take on the risk, to push funding to develop new technologies, which then capitalists like him can use as an opportunity to make money alongside solving the environment. And I think the environmental movement and the trade union movement has to challenge these arguments. We have to say it's not enough to pretend that we're going to somehow magic away the problem of the fossil fuel industry or transform agriculture without real bottom-up groundswell movements acting to do that. In addition, and I suppose linked to that, another role of the trade union movement has to be to hold our politicians to account to deliver this locally, regionally, nationally. It goes without saying that trade unions are always the people who pressure from below and try and fight for better solutions. I think we have to be articulating, particularly in the run-up to COP26, which will give us an enormous platform, I think, to raise radical demands about how our society should be organised. I think we need to be pushing that agenda. And really, I suppose to finish, the final thing I think that we have to do as trade unions is to mobilise. I think we have to be the people standing alongside the environmentalists, campaigning with them, organising with them, discussing and debating with them for all the reasons that Lydia said about young people, but also because actually the cross-fertilisation will bear fruit. I think the impact, as I said at the start, of the climate strikes upon the trade union movement has been inspiring, and we need more of that. COP26 in Glasgow, we don't yet know as an international or national coalition what will be taking place. We don't know whether it will be in real life or whether it will be online or a mixture of both. And it's probably the wrong starting point. There will certainly be forms of mobilisation in Scotland, in regions, and protests internationally at the time, demanding more radical challenges to climate change and taking on the false solutions. I think the trade union movement needs to place itself at the heart of those mobilisations. But in the run-up, as I said, we need to be thinking and organising to make sure that we are involving our members in the discussion that we've got for the time, as the first speaker, Charlie, said, is very, very short, and there are urgent changes needed. And I think the trade union movement is best placed in society to help deliver those. Thank you, Chair.
I'd like to introduce our last speaker, and that is Chloe Jeffries, who's representing Climate Emergency Manchester. So I'll hand over to Chloe.
So maybe, I think what I'll say is kind of runs on from the other speakers, hopefully, but I'm not going to particularly set out what I think kind of trade unions should do to respond to the climate emergency, partly because the other speakers have, partly because there's plenty of information about that. But I want to kind of more sketch out a little bit what we at Climate Emergency Manchester do and have found, and maybe through that begin to point some ways in which we might work a bit more with the trade unions in the future. So there are some familiar faces on this call, but there are also some new ones. So I will also just say a few words about who we are as Climate Emergency Manchester. We are a non-partisan voluntary group, and we connect other citizens. That's crucial. It's not, we're very much about trying to build citizen networks to push for more urgent local action on climate change. We started out in 2019 through the declaration of a climate emergency, and initially our focus was very much about trying to kind of push for a number of organisations, particularly Manchester City Council, to declare for that. In the 2 years since July 2019, after that emergency was declared, our focus has been much more about trying to kind of hold to account and check that the promises of the declaration were indeed kept to. We've maintained a focus on local government and Manchester City Council in particular, but more recently we have developed a few additional strings to our bow, particularly kind of what I call an education and skills strand. So a couple in our group have developed some resources for initially secondary and also maybe in future primary students, as well as some resources for undergraduates. We do quite a lot of training around what we call active citizenship. All of us who are eligible to be are trade union members, and just to situate this, I myself used to be very actively involved in a branch when I lived somewhere else apart from Manchester and was a union caseworker. So what I say tonight is not just from having read on some blog that environmentalists should work with trade unions. I've done the work on the ground as well. So at Climate Emergency Manchester, our particular focus for the past 12 months has been around tracking the scrutiny committees of Manchester Council Some of you will know them very well, but for anybody who doesn't, these are kind of 6 critical friend, or some could say watchdog bodies, who are supposed to hold the Executive and Majesty Council in check. Increasingly, we've tried to broaden that into a kind of sort of experiment in citizen journalism with a wider team of supporters who watch these meetings, blog them, try and draw out some of the key implications, and particularly the implications around climate. What we found through doing this was that climate change wasn't getting the attention it deserved in these meetings, and therefore in the way that the council scrutinises climate. It was getting a bit pushed down very busy agendas, or sometimes not mentioned at all, or not really discussed in a strategic way. So we concluded that it needed its own dedicated committee, and the petition-based campaign around that has been our focus for the past about the past 12 months. One thing we might want to potentially discuss as a way of doing collaboration is what organising and trying to bring people together in a pandemic looks like. We learned a lot about digital and socially distanced organising, running a petition campaign during a pandemic, which wasn't the original plan. We started it at the start of March 2020. I'm just going to mention a couple of things that we learned over the past 12 months that might have implications, you know, both for you and for trade unions. We found through, particularly with having a focus on climate change, that there is a tendency, maybe in any large organisation or bureaucracy, and so it's not just the council, for issues to get siloed or maybe kind of badged as belonging in a certain bit. So one thing that we came up with is that it was quite difficult to get climate change discussed in the Health Scrutiny Committee. We argued that climate change is a health issue, but we were told it kind of belongs here in this environmental bit. I wonder whether there could be something similar with trade unions and their response to the climate emergency, if it gets coupled too neatly with kind of green jobs. And if we want to discuss and think about how you might contribute, it happens in the place where we discuss green jobs, and that's where we're talking about it. We're very busy. So that was one thought that occurred to me. We also could kind of get a reverse, where sometimes we've seen through looking at climate change that a kind of issue can appear fleetingly in multiple places in local authority action, but doesn't really get discussed in the necessary detail, or the right tough questions aren't asked. And retrofit is certainly a kind of example there. And you know, we're thinking, is just getting a mention by those that are making decisions enough to show that action is being done. Something that's been on our minds recently with kind of local elections is about the skills and knowledge that those on councils have. Some have a lot, some have not. They have to cover a kind of large portfolio. And whilst we've kind of often been running a campaign that might sometimes seem a bit adversarial, we know that kind of supporting elected officials and making sure that they do have the same necessary skills and knowledge on sort of carbon budgets, or what the role of the kind of climate change agency is that is in Manchester, is something we need to do, and kind of supporting and upskilling councillors but others is going to become a greater part of what we do. We're managing fine without slides, but unfortunately you're missing now the one slide where the images were crucial, because I've had a brief mood board intermission which showed you a few Google images of what happens when you type in you know, the issue that is most associated with trade unions and the climate issue, the phrase, which is green jobs. And I had done this a few years previously, and I wondered if the results were going to be different. So a few years previously, when I typed green jobs into Google image search, I saw a lot of pictures of wind turbines and high-vis vests. Haven't done that for years, still the same thing. So yeah, the point here is one that I know is being discussed more widely, but I see it happen even at a kind of a local level, which is to make sure we don't just equate this phrase green jobs and not just trade union injection with people who are going to be in hard hats and build wind turbines. Maybe that isn't actually, in somewhere like Manchester, how many wind turbines are we really going to have? Okay, so just quickly, just to run through a few things where our work has come up against the jobs issue, and these are all just really quick observations, because you know, green jobs hasn't been the focus of our work, but we have come across it, and a few points to flag. particularly as it's discussed in Manchester City Council. We've noticed a sort of a lack of definition about what is a green job. It's a phrase that gets bandied around. But do we need some kind of definition list or a little bit more discussion about what that actually means? We see a lot of big numbers, a lot of headline numbers about how many green jobs will be created, not always followed with either granular detail or a plan of how we reach that big figure, certainly on a step-by-step. We've also seen during the past year, during COVID, certain kind of key groups, meetings, at one point even the planning committee get paused. Some of the committees that were supposed to be thinking through green jobs fell into that. Now everything is resuming again, but it's, you know, it's a precedent that things can go many months without picking up due to kind of a crisis. So as people who are monitoring these things, holding to account, pushing for action, we should be aware that just because a group's set up doesn't mean it will always meet or discuss things. We're also sensitive to the fact that Manchester likes to position itself as the sort of as the centre of things, and there may be around green jobs. We've seen Richard Leese, for example, adding his name to sort of local government association and sort of core city type pieces that are saying green jobs, but not always following through on what that means for Manchester. So again, it's returning to this: how do we actually get that granular detail? The final slide that I had was really just to kind of wrap up. It's to say that we like collaboration, working with others, especially if it's local. We're maybe unusual as an environmental group in that we're not particularly interested in COP26. We're highly local, and we collaborate with a lot of other groups on the issues that are those that I haven't particularly raised today. Recently, a report around prioritising land. We've worked with a coalition group around the local plan, which Lydia mentioned, helping lower the kind of barrier for consultation of that. So just because there's a campaign that we've been running over the past 12 months, even though I think I've shown a bit how it might have some implications for the trade unions, we're very up for working together, and we may be kind of inputting advice into campaigns that don't have our name on it. And I hope that's a good starting point for how we might work together.
Any contributions or questions for the panel? Right, first of all, Eddie Garner.
I got it. Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, fantastic motivational and inspirational talks there from the colleagues. Yeah, a couple of points rather than questions. Yeah, firstly, yeah, the idea that the first speaker said that unless we're quick as a trade union movement, you know, big corporations will get involved. And we know so often how this works. I know I'm trying to help for the local eco centre there, and to cut long story short, and every time you're looking at funding and things, you find all these big firms, we know the names, I won't mention them here, get involved in everything, often make a botch of it, and then they call before the parliamentary committee. How often do you see this? You get knuckles wrapped, very sorry, it won't happen again, and they laugh all the way to the bank, having screwed everyone with the money. And we know the same with the PPE and other things. So that's that. Yeah, this is really, trade union has to get involved in the lead at this, don't they? Or else, you know, we miss out, and someone will just make loads of money out of this stuff in someone's pocket. You know, that's the first point. And the other point is, yeah, the idea of, you know, the youngsters getting involved in this, it's so important. We've seen all that fantastic enthusiasm, haven't we? Especially a couple of years ago with the Friday climate protests and the rest of it. And fantastic, we've got to channel that energy, and we've got the advantage here, obviously, of the reps from various education unions, and fantastic, you know, any influence can put there into getting all this stuff on the curriculum. And one fantastic project I've mentioned before, and I mentioned again, the Uniting Schools project, fantastic project. I've had a small involvement, and we go to schools and you're talking to kids, not just about joining trade unions, but what the kind of topics that concern them. And obviously NHS is at the top of the list, but climate change is also up there, and they're really so concerned and they want to do something. And, you know, the Uniting Schools project, Mary Sayer was hoping to be on tonight as an observer, but she had something else to do. But you know, it's a fantastic project there that's being relaunched. that can assist anything else that's going on. Getting the schools there, get the kiddies motivated, but in a structured way so they don't go out and get in trouble, you know, and all that. But yeah, fantastic work there. Good praise to the speakers. I'll leave it at that.
I'll bring in Paul Gerard. Hi, Paul.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much, John. Yeah, very interesting speeches tonight. I'm not one of those who thinks we're going to achieve climate justice through committees. I do think we're going to need to mobilise on the question. I agree with what Martin was saying about technology. I heard what's his name from America on Bar the other day, and it was like technology, every other word was going to be the solution. John Kerry, technology was going to be the solution, and I don't believe it, because technology is always in the hands of the large corporations. I'd like to see us really focus on COP26, and I'm glad that the address of the COP coalition has been shared. I think there's a possibility that we could be returning in 2021 to the kind of massive mobilizations that we saw round about the turn of the millennium, Seattle and Geneva and Milan, I think it was, and various other places. And we had a climate strike movement, including quite a powerful one in Manchester, which has been hibernating during the virus, but which I think is coming out now. And I think those young people will be fantastically ready to the idea of going to Glasgow in November, alongside delegations from other European and other international countries as well. And there probably already are plans, but in terms, it seems to me that the trade union movement has one thing: it's got a resource, it's got a significant resource. We've seen with Unite the way they've been able to fund the bus dispute and so on. Fantastic. If we could mobilise that resource in terms of free transport to get people up to Glasgow in November, I think that would.
Thanks, Paul. I'll go over to Ian Allenson.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I mean, within Unite, one of the problems we always have is a lot of the debate gets dominated by the workers who are in industries that are going to need to close or shrink to tackle climate. And obviously, we need to address those issues and reassure those workers about fighting for good jobs. But it seems incredibly imbalanced the way that the industries that need to expand rarely get included in that. And I think we've got quite an opportunity in Manchester at the moment to shift the debate quite significantly, because around the bus strike, we had Extinction Rebellion playing a really important part in the solidarity, Greater Manchester Tenants Union playing part in the solidarity. If we look in a city like Manchester, transport and housing are the two big ticket items in terms of carbon emissions. It's a few years ago we had the housing maintenance workers on strike, and I guess my question, and this isn't mainly for the speakers, I guess, but for us as a trades council, is how can we try and capitalise on that energy, I guess, from those, from the bus strike in particular, to try to bring together the environmentalists and the workers in transport and housing campaigners, transport campaigners, that have actually built some networks over the last few months to try to shift the agenda. So we're fighting not just around climate jobs in a kind of defensive sense around the industries, like the airport or whatever, but also thinking about how do we push for that massive expansion of public transport and quality public housing that's carbon neutral and so on.
Thanks, Ian. Could I ask a question of any of the panelists, really? Obviously, I was shocked to hear John Selwyn-Gummer was praising Greater Manchester, but fair enough. Are there other areas in the country then which are even further behind Greater Manchester? Because obviously, this is a big fight on our hands, and nobody's trying to say Greater Manchester is perfect. And does that sort of limit what can be done within our area? Because obviously we're an integrated economy. So are there other areas which are, doing nothing, and does that affect what we can do?
A lot of areas are not doing very well, but on that Selwyn Gummer programme this morning, it was a seminar thing, there was a Tory from Shropshire talking about how they were all working together in Shropshire to bring about carbon reduction as a strategic planned thing. So I think we're finding that local politicians are up for it, and they need all the allies they can get, actually. It doesn't matter what colour they are. So I think Manchester is very good at promoting what we do, and we're very good at, you know, doing the reports and showing the graphs, and we've got some very good science from the Tyndall Centre. But we're not on our own. Leeds is doing really well. Liverpool's doing really well. I really like Ian's idea, though, of bringing together the knowledge we've already got from the transport and the housing sector. We've got bus drivers who know what it's like to drive dirty buses, and we've also got bus drivers who know what it's like to drive green buses. So if we bring those people who are actually doing that work together in some way, we can bring them together with some of the children who are actually now campaigning for clean air around their schools. We could do something really exciting in terms of public education. I think public education is the way forward, because it's about individual change and it's about structural change, and both have to go together. And Annette's in a good place here for, you know, making sure that the structures are tightened up in the local authority. They've got to be. We can't do with these segregated, fragmented policy ideas. They've got to be knitted up together. So let's do something creative with those two sectors, as Ian suggested. I'm happy to come and help think about how to do that. Yeah.
Right, thanks, Lydia. Are there
I
any
think
more? Oh, sorry, carry on.
Well, if you look at the actual metrics for addressing climate change, we are miles and miles behind where we're supposed to be. We're not even close to our carbon budget.
Yeah.
And so in a way, it's irrelevant whether other cities are behind us or in front of us. I mean, as Chloe said, you've got to act locally, and we've just got to crack on. I think the issue with climate change, as in fact has been talked about with the Green New Deal in the States, is that we can't have climate change being partisan. What we can have being partisan is how we actually organise to do something about it. So we've got to make the messaging of energy demand reduction, decarbonisation, changing of lifestyles, etc. We've got to make that low, and it'll make many of us itch, but we've got to make that attractive to Tories, because obviously, as we've just discovered, half the country seems to be Tory, or at least the ones that turn out to vote. And so we've got to get them to get excited. The bit that I think is the opportunity is then how we then do something about it. And the point of my presentation was to say we have an opportunity to organise progressive interventions into how we do this. I mean, I'd love to. Martin, I'd love to actually chat with you more about what the economic model is that we really want. I mean, coming out of this, I mean, obviously we could sit and wait like the LM crowd for it to be a pre-revolutionary situation, and there'll be all that kind of upheaval, but that's not practical, and it won't do the job quick enough, and your average upheaval tends to be quite carbon intensive. So we've kind of got to try and work with what we've got and move it into a progressive place. And I think we have got those opportunities. The corporates are going to do their thing anyway, but we've also got these opportunities to organise and inspire. And I worry that we aren't getting organised. We're not inspiring young people with actual models for change that can actually be delivered, which is why a lot of them aren't engaging as well as we can, or struggling to find ways of engaging. And I think I'd like to hope that those of us with a progressive mindset now need to look to the models we can create and make them.
Cheers, Charlie. I'm going to go over to Annette.
Yeah, so I'm Annette Wright. I'm a local councillor on Manchester City Council in Hume, and I moved the motion about Manchester declaring a climate emergency. And there's lots of things going on internally within the council around its scrutiny process that I think is going to help both with transparency and with us actually getting into the detail of what's going on, and hopefully not just within the city council, which is what we've been looking at so far. So, you know, I'm happy to talk to anybody about that, but I'm here mainly because I'm on the executive of the Trades Council, and I think we're starting to develop an idea here for ourselves in what the last few speakers have said about looking at jobs people are doing, and good jobs and bad jobs. And I don't think we've got the formation of a great idea yet, but I think given our resources and what we're able to do, I think we can always work on mobilizing for things, as well as some people have mentioned. I think that's just one of the things that we do when stuff's happening. But I think we should be looking to find a specific role for ourselves within all this. And I think this idea of jobs is interesting. And just the other thing that I think Chloe said a while ago about that she said in relation to scrutiny committees, that making sure that these issues are raised kind of everywhere. We don't have a person in Manchester Trades Council whose responsibility it is to raise climate issues everywhere they go, and maybe we should look at that as well. But I think, yeah, whether we organise, whether it is just another meeting, which is one of the things we do in Manchester, is bring people together at meetings, or whether it's something more than that, of kind of drawing this comparison of where jobs are, where militant workers are, where we need different jobs, and where we have jobs that we want to shout about because the jobs that are good for the planet. So I haven't got a specific proposal, but I think we're kind of getting to a point where I think we can find a role for ourselves that could be different to what everybody else is already doing, but can kind of make some sort of significant contribution just as Manchester Trades Council. That's what I've been looking for from this meeting tonight, and I think there's been some really good contributions around things that we can work on to do that.
Thanks, Annette. Evan, you got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, I mean, I think what shines out of all of this for me is there's a number of words that people have mentioned, including some quoting some Tories. One of them is planning, and I think not just in this country, but I think internationally, we have to embrace the whole concept of economic planning, yeah, because this ain't going to happen on the basis of expecting either individuals, wherever they are on the socio-economic ladder, or big companies to do this for us. Partly because of the fact that even if they've got the will to do it, they don't have the whereabout, the wherefore to do it, because we're talking about the planet. We're talking about such a huge, you can't get, well, obviously, you can't get much bigger than the planet. Well, you can, obviously the whole universe is bigger than the planet, but from our point of view, there's nothing bigger than the planet. And social planning and money, money has to, money that's going to be directed by people collectively. I think the COVID crisis has shown us a little bit about where we could go forward with this, because a lot of the rubbish that we were told about, there's no money to do this, there's no money to do that. Well, that's been proved to be a load of nonsense, yeah. And in terms of all sorts of money that's been spent on this crisis, we're talking here about a crisis that is 1,000 times more serious in the medium to long term than COVID was. And what we've also seen, though, and I think a lot of people are cottoning onto this, is the extent to which, when you don't have proper planning and when you don't have social control, and when it's left to the private sector, how useless that can be and how wasteful it can be. So there's a whole load of things that can be brought together, I think, in terms of what's been happening, in terms of what's been happening recently. These, to me, these are absolute bottom lines, red lines: planning, social control, You know, the market is not going to do this here and internationally. And at the risk of possibly being a little bit, well, I know I'll be a little bit controversial here. If you look at one of the biggest economy in the world now, the People's Republic of China, this is a society that has raised record numbers of people out of absolute poverty, and there's all sorts of problems with the way it's been done. But what you also see, if you look beyond a lot of the propaganda against China and actually look at research some of the stuff that's going on there, the amount of effort, the amount of money that has been put into combating global warming and trying to do things in a much more ecologically sustainable way, it's absolutely incredible. You know, the models on which some of the new Chinese cities are being built. I'm not saying that we in this country, we're not China, we're a different place, we're a different country, different history and all the rest of it. But I think there are things that can be learned from what's been happening there as well.
Thanks very much, Evan. I've got two hands up. I'll go to Martin first and then bring Lydia in afterwards.
I think Annette raises a really important point about what do we do concretely, because I think it's very easy for the trade. In fact, we must do it as a trade union movement, as the left, raise the question of jobs as a campaigning issue. You know, it's a brilliant part of campaigning solidarity for striking bus workers to say we need more buses in the future and we need more. You know, that's a no-brainer, as they say. But I also think Annette's right. We do need to be more concrete about what can we do as trade unions, as the Trade Council, or as trade union branches. And it might be worth the Trades Council thinking about reaching out to Leeds TUC, which has got a very active environmental subcommittee and has produced a very detailed report around retrofitting of Leeds homes for heating and energy and so on. And it's a sort of mini green climate jobs report, which is driven by the trade union movement. I think they estimate that if it is implemented, they get around 300,000 new jobs in the Leeds area by 2030 or so. It's very detailed, and it's had a lot of input from scientists, from local trade union activists, from politicians and so on. And it might be something that would give the Trades Council a bit of an idea what you could do locally. It may not be the right thing, but it certainly would. It's something that's inspired me and I think has been quite influential amongst the trade union movement wider.
Thanks, Martin. So I'll bring Lydia in and then we'll have Chris Jones. It might have to be the last contribution because we have a little bit of business before we finish at 9 p.m. just to finish off from council. So Lydia first and then Chris.
Martin's idea of linking up with Leeds Trades Council is a very good one. They've got at Leeds College of Building, and the UCU people there are very active, and it's good to have a national forum now that we can talk to each other. What I'd like to respond to is first of all, yes, please, Annette, can I come and talk to you about how we can strengthen the planning committee so that they actually do stop some of this rubbish housing being put up? And secondly, don't let us let Andy Burnham off the hook. You know, he actually gets the money. He gets the money for adult education for the whole 10 local authorities. We need him to be using that money for us. So let's not think that Andy's getting all the plaudits and he'll run another Green Summit in November and then everybody will go and say how wonderful they are. Let's actually make a fuss now and say, right, where is the action? What's going on? It's still being done as a very covert, rather isolated thing, done with a website, which is as good as they can, because actually they haven't got very many people working there either. But I do think that you need to know that trade unionists can be a bloody nuisance with their employers already. And I am being a bloody nuisance inside the University of Manchester. So I've ganged up with the students and we formed an alliance and we are scrutinising all the clever things they say they're doing. They keep telling us they're the best in the world at all sorts of environmental stuff, and we know it's not true. So we're calling them out, and we're bringing unions together to call them out. And we're saying to them, actually, we can help you do this for real. You can have the expertise of your students. You can have the expertise of your staff. Don't keep telling me you're doing all this research, because it's not actually panning out on the ground. And the carbon reduction plan for Manchester University is simply not good enough. So I think being a bloody nuisance as a trade union is vital, and we have to carry on doing that. So I want to come and talk to Annette. Let's go to Leeds. Let's invite them over, and let's carry on being a bloody nuisance.
Thanks, Lydia. Don't forget to look at the chat, everyone. There's some useful links and email addresses being posted in there over the last few minutes. I'll come on to Chris. It will be the last speaker that we have on this particular part. So, Chris Jones.
Yes, and I sort of really don't want to be the last speaker because of what I'm going to say. I don't know whether you can see that I'm just holding up. That is the easy-to-read guide published in 1993 to the outcome of the 1992 Rio Summit. And quite frankly, a lot of what we're talking about there now is in there. Not everything, things have moved on and what have you. And I don't know if many of you know, a few of you will have heard me say this before, but in 1994, the follow-up conference to Rio took place in Manchester, organised by the British government with delegates from 80 cities from around the world, which included the local authority, the trade unions, businesses and the community. An interesting conference. I attended it on behalf of this council, and Richard Leese attended it on behalf of the City Council. So there's a long history of being around, and Martin's right in what he said about COP26 shows we're a quarter of a century on from the dynamic that supposedly started at that time. But the reason why I've said that and why I'm wishing I wasn't speaking last is because the delegations to that conference in 1994 in Manchester were the local authority, the trade unions, the community. And over the subsequent period, we have been formally excluded to a very large extent to the people who are actually really discussing these things. Because the problem we've got is the power of the big corporations has not changed. The demagogy of that conference in 1994 that included the wider community in was demagogy. And we need to be addressing the power behind it all. That has been, well, the world has changed in that quarter century and we've gone backwards. So, you know, the work that comrades are doing is absolutely brilliant, and there is progress being made, but we're actually not taking it as deeply seriously organisationally as we need to do. There's lots of stuff going on with young people and what have you, but the trade union stuff is good, but it's on the edges. And there's a much bigger power struggle to be had. You know, the fact that Biden's making the agenda with his technology is a world political reality. And it's actually those really big, deep issues of power and control that we have to address. And, you know, we've spent a long time making some lots of good points, but not quite beginning to break through. 1994 was more representative than the kind of representation we've got for what we're trying to do today.
Thanks, Chris.